So last time we talked, environmental services had kind of just finished its space reorganization. That's kind of calmed down, but we're still mostly virtual. It's been still hectic, so just FYI, please continue to bear with us as things settle down in the next few months. And so with that, I think that kind of covers the basic introduction. And so I'll turn it over to Patrick Carpenter.
Thanks, Anthony, and thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate everyone's participation and get a chance to connect this way. And I think we've done more now virtually than we ever did before in person, so this is great. And so today, one of the things we want to do with our brown bag is, we want to we just want to see where the interest is and what people, want to learn and want to share. And so we thought since this was Archaeology Month, that, this would be a good opportunity to share archaeology, focus on archaeology. So today, our archaeology section is going to be looking at, sharing archaeology stuff. And so I think we're going to lead off with Matt Kuhn, and he's going to share some really cool sites and cool information. And then we're going to start, as we go through the presentations on the archaeology, we're going to get a little more technical. So if you're not an archaeologist and you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand, use the chat feature, chime in. We all have different varying levels of understanding of some of the terms and concepts and practices of archaeology. And so feel free to ask questions. And I think, the archaeologists would be happy to answer those questions. And we look forward to sharing today. And also, we always ask this, but if we start to get closer to time and we don't have time, but we also just always want to solicit your suggestions for future brown bags topics. It doesn't, it could be about, we've talked about, project management side, cost estimate side, some of the more other parts of it that we all do in our practice. And so just please feel free, to let us know what areas you'd like to learn more about, want to share, or get, and just, as a community, what we could all, do together. And so with that, Matt, do you want me to pull up the file and start from there, or do you want to open it and start sharing your screen that way?
I can open it.
Okay. And I'll hand it off to Matt Kuhn. And feel free again to ask questions and make comments throughout.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. So as Patrick said, our archaeology unit, we're going to run through a series of topics today. I'll be starting out somewhat at the end of the archaeological process, and we'll kind of be working our way backward, but also from less detail to more detail. I'm Matt Kuhn. I'm an archaeologist with INDOT Cultural Resources since 2006, and I'd like to run through a few eligible archaeological sites that we have investigated recently or are under investigation. First one of these that I'll talk about is the Porter County Poor Farm, which was encountered during an intersection improvement project on State Road 2 in Porter County. Historical documents tell us that the farm of William Pennock was purchased by the county in 1855 for use as the poor farm, and he was hired to be the superintendent. We know that the county constructed a new building in 1856, which is shown here on an 1876 map. And that was used until a larger facility was built in 1906 to accommodate an increasing population at the facility, partly as they started to move beyond being just a poor farm, but taking in people with mental illnesses or socially undesirable traits, perhaps. The Phase 1A survey for this project did identify concentrations of brick and mortar around the mapped location of the first official pore farm structure, as well as other artifacts like 19th century ceramics that were consistent with that type of site. Now, at the time of the survey, the main part of the site looked something like this. There's an on-the-ground photo on the left, aerial photo on the right, showing a pretty featureless open field. It's pretty difficult to envision that anything had once been there. And this is perhaps, a more challenging situation for typical archaeological investigation methods, where you're putting in hand excavated units and mechanical trenches just to see what's there and where it's located. But on the other hand, this was a good setting for the use of geophysics. So INDOT Cultural Resources conducted a geophysical survey of a portion of this site. We did a magnetic survey. A magnetometer is an instrument that can detect localized variations in the Earth's magnetic field. These can result from disturbances like pits and trenches. It's also sensitive to iron, any iron-bearing artifacts, rocks with iron in them, other things as well, like burnt earth.
Hey, Matt.
Bricks. Yes.
Hey, sorry, this is Patrick. We have some comments that people aren't able to see the presentation.
Oh.
I can see it, but I know Andrew Martin just posted that if you click on the PowerPoint icon in the right corner, that might be helpful. Okay, so a few people cannot see it.
So some people can see it and some people cannot.
Yeah, it sounds like, some people.
Well, that's an interesting quandary.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like there's any necessarily pattern to it in terms of inside the organization.
Yeah, some people can click it and it works. So wonder if we put the presentation in the chat and then people can kind of follow along. Do you think that would work?
Yeah, I don't have any.
Okay. And you could continue and then we can. So some people, so Karen says it can't display content.
Are you are you sharing your screen, Matt, or how are you sharing the presentation?
I'm sharing the actual PowerPoint document rather than the screen, because if we share the screen, I'm not sure other people can take control of it, everybody would have to open the document and share their own screen. This way we can just hand it off.
Okay. Let's see. What?
So will you be sharing the document then in the chat so that people watching can open it up on their own machines?
Yeah, I'm going to put it. Yeah, I'm going to put it in there. And that way, people can follow along. Okay. Oh, that's a long link. Okay, in the chat, I've put a link to the presentation. So, okay, so Veronica also said she went from the team's desktop to the web application and it's working. So it might be to, how people are accessing the meeting. Okay, and so we are on slide 6. All right, so I think you can go on, Matt. And we'll try to navigate behind the scenes to help.
All right, we might need to indicate to people when I move from one slide to another then so that they can All right. Takes me back to the old days of presenting at conferences when we had a slide carousel. And you'd have to be next slide, please. All right. So I'll return to it, and I hope everybody will be able to follow along. We, INDOT Cultural Resources, conducted a magnetometer survey over a portion of the site where we believe that structure to have been located. And we identified a number of both modern and historical features in that survey. I'll just quickly run through a few of them as examples of some of the potential and just what these things look like in the data versus on the ground. First one I'll talk about is the large sort of rectangular black and white feature outlined in red, which is consistent with something like a pile of rubble or a cellar, particularly a rubble-filled cellar. And that is precisely, hey, I've lost my, that's precisely what it was. Let me pull that back up. Sorry about the technical issues here.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
Maybe what we should do is I can just I can pull up the presentation on my screen and share my screen, and then you guys can just do it old school like you said and say next slide please, just because it seems like we're continuing to have issues. Not everyone can access the document that was posted in the chat. I don't know if there's a better idea, but
If you think that will make it more accessible or visible, whatever works the best, I'm all for.
Yeah, let's try it. We'll see. All right, so Anthony, you'll share your screen?
Yes, I will need a moment though to pull it up.
Okay. Thanks everybody for your patience. When you try this out, internally we don't have any problems because we all have the permissions, I guess. But so Matt, while we're waiting, we had a question in the chat from Veronica, and it says, in the meantime, can I ask what kind of magnetometer you used? And does INDOT own their own mag unit?
We do own our own magnetometer. It's a Geoscan FM 256 flex gate gradiometer. It's not the friendliest piece of equipment to work with, but extremely reliable and does produce good data once you wrangle with it a bit. So yeah, we do have that, and it's available for us to use to do additional surveys if any projects come up. We also can do electrical resistivity surveys, and to a limited extent right now, ground penetrating radar, but we'll be increasing those capabilities in the future.
All right, I've shared my screen, and I guess it looks like some people are finally getting to see the graphics. Just let us know if there's any issues. So Matt, direct me. Am I on the right slide? Do you need to?
No, that looks fine.
Okay.
All right. I hope this goes a little more smoothly. This is what that cellar area looked like during excavation. There was something of an occupational layer at the bottom, overlaid by a fairly complex series of strata of fill and rubble. As is often the case when people are filling in large holes, it's a good place to dispose of unwieldy things, pieces of trash. You can see at the lower left, there's what I'd believed to be probably an enameled metal basin of some sort, another piece of metal. Some more large pieces of metal shown on the right. Some definite concentrations of brick. So some of those types of artifacts help to explain one of the reasons why this feature was so visible. It was only under half of the structure. We believe the rest of the structure was actually removed. Going into this, I expected to see, buried foundations or demolition debris, but it was actually not much like that visible. Okay, next slide, Anthony. Another feature a short distance from the structure is number 2, labeled here. Next slide. Which was a brick cistern. On the left is what it looked like when the consultants first uncovered it, and then it's shown through various stages of bisection and excavation. Next. A third similar anomaly was a little bit to the south. Next. Which was the remnants of an outbuilding. You can see on the left what's left of the foundation, which is sort of a rubble-filled trench, a little bit of brick left in the foundation at the lower left. There's a partition in the center. One portion of it to the left had a floor that was a brick floor over a layer of cement or concrete. The bricks were removed. The whole entire structure had been removed historically, as well as the bricks being pulled off of the floor. You could still see the impressions of the bricks left in the cement. This is currently being interpreted as a summer kitchen, although it's still under analysis. Next. Different type of feature. The last thing I'll talk about from this site is a type of strong feature that's generally associated with metal objects like rebar, fence post, pipes. The ones labeled 1 and 2 are associated with modern utilities. The one labeled 3, however, was associated with a historical well. Next. And this is an image again showing on the left when it was first uncovered and then through various stages of excavation. We don't know a lot about the chronology of this site, if the well postdates the cistern, how long the well was used, if it was used after the building. There was a standing Liberty quarter recovered in the fill of the well, which was produced between 1916 and 1930. So we know it was filled in sometime after 1916. But the artifacts are still under analysis. Next. And there were a large number of artifacts, both from these features and additional features that were identified outside of the area that we surveyed geophysically. It's clear, though, that this project probably did recover significant information about the site and also hopefully details about the lives of a type of population that is historically typically very poorly documented. Next. Next site I'd like to tell you about is a prehistoric site that was identified during investigations for I-69 Section 6, the Hodges site. It's located on a floodplain terrace at the west fork of the White River near the confluence with Crooked Creek. Phase 1 and 2 investigations suggested or demonstrated that the site was significant, and so it underwent Phase 3 data recovery. Those investigations recovered a variety of materials dating from the late Archaic to the late Middle Woodland period. An early woodland hearth was identified as well. Next. The primary component of the site is an Oliver culture habitation. Oliver is a late prehistoric culture that was found across central Indiana from roughly 1200 to 1450. The red arrow shows the approximate location of this site. 9 features were encountered during the excavations, including mostly refuse pits, a few hearths or fire pits or ovens, a smudge pit, which is a type of feature generally associated with processing hides. A buried midden was encountered at the site. That's a type of archaeological feature that results from occupation, intensive or repeated occupation, as refuse and waste and organic matter are continuously deposited. Next. Radiocarbon dates from the features are pretty tightly clustered. There are clearly at least 2 occupation periods. Statistical analysis suggests that there might be at least 3 with a fine separation between some of the points. Next. Next slide.
One sec, Matt.
Oh,
I heard, I got you. But
all right.
My computer's being a little slow right now. So,
of course.
There we go.
All right. A lot of ceramics were recovered from this site, nearly 60% of the assemblage. And there were over 600 of those pieces that came from feature contexts. Of course, as is often the case, these were primarily fairly small pieces, but a number of sizable and refittable, I guess I should say, pieces were recovered. And again, often from feature contexts, which is excellent. Next. So it appears that this was a short-term seasonal encampment, probably repeatedly occupied. The investigation showed that the people who were living there periodically exploited both upland and floodplain resources. They were consuming maize at the site, but did not appear to be processing it there. There was an emphasis on consumption of nuts. Nutshell to maize was a 1.3 to 1 ratio. And there were also pitted stones recovered from the site that were consistent with nuts. And that is something that has been observed with other sites to be a characteristic of Oliver culture sites from the later portion. And this site does appear to be somewhat later in that period, with dates clustering between about 1310 and 1430. So this site has produced significant information about a fairly poorly documented type of site, these small, short-term, repeatedly occupied campsites. Next. The last site I'll talk about is one that's currently undergoing phase 3 investigations. This is the state line site, which is 12D18 in Indiana, and has just a whole bunch of site numbers on the Ohio side of the line, of the imaginary line. This is a large Fort Ancient village site. Fort Ancient is another late prehistoric culture. It overlaps in time with the Oliver culture that I just talked about at the last site. Again, the red arrow gives an approximate location of where this site is located, near the Ohio River on a terrace of the Great Miami, near a salt spring, which is not uncommon for this time period. Phase 2 investigations at the site identified 3 features in shovel probes, which is fairly uncommon, but maybe not unexpected at a site known to be of this size and significance. 3 more were identified in hand excavated units. A geophysical survey was conducted by a consultant that identified additional potential features. The phase 2 also identified intact midden, including midden that was buried under historical fill on the Indiana side. Next. So the phase 3 data recovery is in progress. No structures have been identified so far, which are very common on late prehistoric sites, and other portions of this site that have been investigated had multiple structures. So this may just be a different type of area of the site, but it's still early days. There are areas of dense midden, numerous features in that midden. Over 30,000 artifacts have been recovered so far, and that's likely to double, I would guess. Next. Here are examples of some of the pieces of pottery that have been recovered. These are more or less fresh out of the ground with the dirt still on them. In addition to recovering significant information about a really significant, important site, it's important to note that we've been working in consultation with our tribal partners on this through the process. We've developed a treatment plan in coordination with them in the event that graves are encountered during the excavations. There's been a tribal monitor on site during excavation, who is himself an archaeologist. So in addition to being an example of data recovery from a really significant site, it's also a good example of where we are now in terms of success in our consultation with our tribal partners, and more being able to include them in more of the archaeological process as these sites go under investigation. And that's the end of my presentation. So if Sean's here, I will turn the microphone over to him, and I think you can go to the next slide, Anthony.
And Matt, we have Jason's been patient and has had his hand up for a while. So Jason, okay. Go Block. Would you like to? You said a question or want to say anything?
Are you there, Jason?
Yeah, sorry, that was an unfortunate mistake. I don't know how to undo that.
Oh, that's fine. Now you got to make something up though. Ask. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, spotlight's on you, Jason. Come up with a good question.
We also have
a question.
Just kidding. Just kidding.
Yeah, what David said is Kevin has a question in the chat. He asks, what is the temper? And do you have decorated Fort Ancient ceramics with grit temper?
Okay, I guess I would ask which site that would be in reference to. At the Oliver Phase site, the ceramics, I believe, are mostly or all grit tempered. I don't know that there's anything that would necessarily be a pure Fort Ancient ceramic apart from the Fort Ancient types of motifs common on Oliver pottery. At the state line site, during these excavations, I honestly don't know. This is going on right now. The pieces I saw, I know some of them appeared to be shell tempered, but they hadn't been cleaned yet. Short answer of that is, I'm afraid I don't know yet. So we'll be waiting for more information from the consultant to get any kind of real breakdown on the artifacts.
Kevin, you want to jump in? I see you had a follow-up comment.
Yeah, I do see that the stuff on the left looks like it might be grit tempered, but I'm hesitant to say anything based on the photograph.
Yeah, these haven't even been washed yet at this point. It's hard to tell the difference between some of the dirt and what might be tempered. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's kind of ahead of where my knowledge is about what's going on at the site for me to be able to answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, we're bringing this hot off the presses here. One of the advantages.
I took these pictures in the field like last week during a site visit, so I should have looked more carefully at the shards when I was photographing them.
Oh, David Dias, a good question for some of us non-archaeologists. Is there any way you can give a short explanation of what that means?
Oh, about temper?
Yeah, about temper.
Yeah, that's sure. When you make ceramics, you're making them out of clay. And in order to prove the working characteristics of that, and also the drying characteristics, I think to help prevent it from cracking during drying and firing, and also when it's being heated and cooled for cooking, you add something that's non-plastic into that something hard basically that doesn't contract and expand like the ceramic does. And people have used different things like vegetable fibers, crushed up rocks, which is what we're referring to when we say grit temper, crushed up shells, which would be the shell temper as well, and other materials as well sometimes. But sometimes those things are diagnostic of a particular sort of cultural pattern, or sometimes they tell you something about the time period when something was made as well. For instance, with Fort Ancient, you might see predominantly grit tempered moving into more shell tempered later in time. And so I think that's part of the reason Kevin was asking, because he was interested in exactly what type of tempering was associated with the decorative designs that he's seeing on these sherds.
Oh, I think that's a great answer. It's really interesting.
Yeah, any other questions before we move on? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Yeah, that was great.
All right, so Matt had the exciting part of the presentation, and now we're going to get into more of the nitty gritty. And I'm Sean Miller. I'm the archaeology team lead and tribal liaison for INDOT. And I've also been at INDOT since 2006. And I want to present on a few of the topics that I'm mostly questioned about. And so those are cemetery development plans, archaeology assessments, and when we need to conduct additional archaeological surveys or addendum reports. Next slide, Anthony, please. So when are cemetery development plans required? We only require cemetery development plans when there is an impact to a cemetery. So typically this will be when there is a temporary or permanent right-of-way acquisition from a cemetery. That would be an impact. So say we're taking temporary right-of-way to improve a cemetery driveway or to move decorative fences or columns, that would be an impact. And so we would ask for a cemetery development plan. Not necessarily because the cemetery is within 100 feet of our project, but because we're having a direct impact to that cemetery. That's based on our definition of the of how the state law reads, which is a cemetery plan is not required if a person intends to erect, alter, or repair an existing structure for an incidental or existing use that would not impact the burial ground or cemetery. So if you think about INDOT projects, we do a lot of overlays and preventive maintenance type projects that might go past several cemeteries in a 20-mile stretch. But those type of projects aren't acquiring right-of-way and typically don't impact cemeteries. So those sorts of projects won't require a cemetery development plan. Now we've developed through the years kind of our own thoughts about when cemetery development plans would be needed beyond what the state law tells us. So INDOT Cultural Resources Office would suggest a cemetery development plan be prepared when there is a cemetery whose boundaries are unknown or undefined that's located next to existing or proposed right-of-way. So these would be instances where there might just be a few headstones of a family plot that isn't bordered by a fence or a wall or landscaping, and whose boundaries are really unclear. And in those instances, we would probably, we might suggest geophysics in tandem with archival research. just to try to decipher what those boundaries might be and to make sure that we are not having any impacts to the cemetery. We might also want a cemetery development plan when there are no headstones and there's just historical or anecdotal evidence that places a cemetery within 100 feet of a project area. So these are cases where maybe in your records check, there's a mapped cemetery location, but there are no headstones remaining, or a property owner informs you of an old family burial ground next to their farm, something like that, where you know, there's just really no evidence on the ground of a cemetery. Again, we might want geophysics conducted, but at minimum, we probably want some archival research looking into the cemetery and where it could be located. It's important to keep in mind that cemetery development plans are required by state law and not NEPA. So INDOT Environmental Services, we can't require that cemetery development plans be done before the CE is approved, but we do prefer that cemetery development plans are done during the environmental process so that we can ensure that the state law is being followed. If a cemetery development plan is not done during NEPA, we would ask for a commitment to be made in the CE that the development plan would be completed before construction. Cemetery development plans prepared for state or INDOT projects, they must go to DHPA for review and approval. Cemetery development plans for local city or county projects, they're to go to the executive of the city or county for approval. And looks like Jason Golbach, you have your hand up. Be happy to answer your question.
Sean, you might be able to foresee this question. But what if it's a structure that doesn't do territory road that's not going to impact burial ground? Does that change things?
Okay, so you're cutting out a little bit, but I think the gist of the question was if you don't have an existing road. So building a new road within 100 feet of a cemetery.
Correct.
Okay. In that case, I'd have to look at the state law to read what it says about new, but I'm assuming that one would probably be needed. And I know you have a project in mind, so I'll just have to look into that specific project.
That's fine.
But
thanks.
And everything that I'm presenting on today they're going to be, these are, our answers to general questions when all things being normal, I guess. There's always, we look at projects on a case-by-case basis. And so though these are general guidelines, there will be instances where we might have to, backtrack on our guidance. And that's, that goes for all of our guidance. There's always, there could always be something new with a project that changes how we do things or look at things. So that's important to keep in mind as we go through these topics. Are there any other questions about cemetery development plans before we move on?
Yeah, Sean, David Dye has a question in the chat. How much time is needed for the CDP review and approval?
For INDOT, it is, I think everything is currently running at 15 days. And then at DHPA, it's 30 days. And with the LPAs, it may be longer, maybe up to 60 days. We have an agreement with DHPA to review our documents in 30 days, but I believe within state law, it does say 60 days.
And just quick question, Sean, is that when you say our offices will review it in 15 days, is that 15 calendar or business days?
15 business days for INDOT CRO's review time.
Right. And then DHPA is 30 calendar days, right?
Yep. You're right. Okay. There's no other questions on CDP.
Hey, Sean, you're cutting out a little bit.
Okay, I'm ready to go on to the next topic if there's no other questions. All right. Archaeology assessments. Am I sounding all right?
Yep.
All right. So, as many of you are aware by now, hopefully, we have kind of gone away from the old school records checks reports that were just records, results of DHPA records checks, and have evolved into what we're calling archaeology assessments. Now, when archaeologists prepare an archaeological assessment, we still expect that a records check, a standard records check, is being conducted. So you still have to check SHARD and SHARD GIS, and looking for sites within or adjacent to your project area, checking to see if project area has been previously surveyed. It must be done by a QP archaeologist, so must be on DHPA's roster. We like archaeology assessments to be done when in an urban setting that's not conducive for traditional survey methods. And usually these would be on projects that would have fallen under the minor projects PA, but did not because of an above ground issue. So, these are like curb ramp replacement projects, streetscaping, things like that would normally be exempt from full 106 and would fall under the minor projects PA with no archaeology being done. But because of some above ground issue, must go through full 106. And so we need to address archaeology in some manner. And so that's where these assessments come into play. So when preparing your archaeological assessment, you should be using, like I said, SHARD GIS at a minimum, but then also looking at historical and current aerial images to see how the landscape has changed through time, how commercial modern development has affected the project area. Should be checking for sandboard maps for any unusual features that might be under existing roadways or sidewalks, and also the Indiana Interurban Railroad ebook, which is freely available on Google and is a really handy resource for looking for old interurbans in rural or urban areas. And so someone has taken the time to map every interurban route throughout the state. And it includes links to its operators and the period of time when it was in use, and just kind of you can get a whole history of a single interurban line through this ebook on Google. Archaeology assessments should be included with the early coordination letter, and if not there, then at least in the report distribution letter that's transmitting the HPR to SHPO. We've also seen them in report distribution letters associated with effects letters. So sometime before the finding is made, the archaeology assessment should be presented to SHPO in a report distribution letter. And then it should be reiterated in the 811 document with SHPO's concurrence in the appendix. Any questions on archaeology assessments?
Kevin, no one asked about providing that link. Is there a way that we can provide that link and the links that I have later in my part of the presentation to anybody who's interested?
Yep, I'll get that to, yep, we can do that. I have the link bookmarked. And that's for the interurban, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep. Yes. There's the interurban ebook, and there's also railroad ebook, which maps all of the abandoned railroads in the state. So both of those sources are good to use in these archaeology assessments. Okay, next slide, Anthony. Thank you. So the last topic I'll be covering is called Are You Covered? So this is about when additional archaeology may or may not be needed. We get this question a lot, and again, this is, general guidance, and it could always change based on project specifics. So it's important to always check with INDOT CRO before before committing to additional archaeology. We can assist the archaeological consultants very quickly in determining whether or not additional archaeology is needed, and we can provide input up front before committing to additional costs. But additional survey may be required if, when conducting your archaeological records check, you see that a portion or all of your current project area was previously surveyed, or additional right-of-way is added to a project that you had just surveyed 4 months ago. So additional work may be needed when the previous survey did not conform to current standards, and that's before the 2008 revision to the draft VHPA guidelines. So before 2008, shovel probes were placed at 10-meter intervals and not screened. And since 2008, they've been shovel probes have been on 15-meter intervals and screened. So if you're reviewing a bridge replacement that was previously surveyed in 1985 and was shovel probed at 10-meter intervals, it was not screened, and it's come up again in 2020, even if the project area is the same as it was in the 80s, you're probably going to have to go and take another look at it at 15-meter intervals and screen soils. Additional work may also be required if the survey did not conform to the INDOT manual. So we're a little stricter on some of the methodologies than what's stated in the guidelines. So if the prior survey did not shovel probe woods or no-till fields or residential lawns, we would ask that those areas be shovel probed to current standards and not, and not written off. If new areas are more than a standard transect interval in width from the original survey limits, additional work may be needed. So if 30 meters is added to a project area that was only surveyed by 15-meter intervals, you might have to, or 15-meter transect, then you may have to go out and perform 2 new transects. If additional right-of-way is acquired from adjacent to recorded archaeological sites, additional work might be required to survey those sites at a lower interval. So additional work may be required in those instances. And when new right-of-way is adjacent to areas not tested during the initial survey because of disturbances. So there may be a stretch that was not surveyed a year ago because of a water line, and now maybe only 8 meters has been added to the project. So less than, the 15-meter transect for shovel probes, but because that utility line was only visually inspected and not shovel probed, we would expect there to be shovel probes outside of the, disturbed area now that the right-of-way is extending beyond it. It's important to contact us when additional right-of-way is added to the project, not just so that we can check to see if additional archaeology is needed, but to get our historians on board and to make sure that no additional above ground review is needed too, which, it may be above ground studies may need to be done if a project's more than 5 years old or has expanded beyond the previously approved APE. So it takes CRO as a team to look at projects when additional right-of-way is added. So yeah, I think that's all I have on my presentation. Any questions on when additional work may or may not be needed or anything else that I covered? If not, then we'll move on with Patty Jo, and so she will get a technical, a few slides in. The first few slides do apply to all consultants, so hopefully you'll stick around through the at least the first part of Patty Jo's presentation. If you don't think you'll stick around for the whole thing.
Thanks, Sean.
Hi, everybody. My name is Patty Jo Korsnowski, and I am the newest archaeologist with INDOT starting in February 2019. And today I'm going to talk to you about archaeology survey areas and Phase 1A best practices. If you could click the slide, please. So the first thing that I want to talk about is shapefiles. For archaeology projects, please send us GIS shapefiles and not KMZ files. We also require that both site and survey area files need to be included with the submission. And if you have an isolate site, we prefer it to be a 5 meter by 5 meter polygon shapefile and not a point file, although a buffer around a point file may work. We ask that you send the polygon instead. We need you to send them as NAD 1983 UTM Zone 16N, which is in Indiana. And again, we want to ask that you're only sending polygon shape files, not point or line files, which I have shown which one we want below with the arrow in red. Next slide, please. So we encourage you to get the plans and shape files that you need from your design consultants, and please avoid designer shape files, generic mapping, and avoid construction limit shape files. We've been getting a lot of construction limit shape files, and we do not want that. We need the survey area shape file. That is the area that you're actually going to survey with the archaeological reconnaissance. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about the survey area. The survey area will include all direct and indirect impacts and includes all right-of-way, which means that you're going to be using existing, new, permanent, and temporary right-of-way. Do not assume that the right-of-way is previously disturbed. Access route and staging areas need to be assessed, and if it's unclear how construction equipment will access the portion of the project area, please contact us and ask whether easements will be required for access, as these also need to be evaluated. Next slide, please. So determining your right-of-way and construction limits from project plans. I've provided below a project plan where I have highlighted the proposed right-of-way in red, the existing right-of-way in blue, and the construction limits in green. And again, we keep receiving a lot of construction limits in green. We really want it to go all the way out to the red, which is the proposed right-of-way. Next slide, please. This is a project that we went to a couple weeks ago, and we went out into the field with the hot pink shapefile. And after talking to my mentor, Sean Miller, he noted that perhaps that this shapefile was a little bit too big. So in the field, I contacted our consultant and I asked them for the project plans, which they provided on the left. You can see it highlighted in yellow. So we decided after looking at the project area in the field that it needed to be expanded a little bit, which we ended up with the light pink shapefile there. But you can see what the consultants originally gave us was the hot pink, the red, which is the right of way, and the green, which is proposed structure that we'd be working on. And next slide, please. So the entire project area, a proposed right-of-way must be tested. We use 3 different methods for that: pedestrian survey, visual inspection, and shovel testing. So with the pedestrian survey, this can only be done on rain-washed plowed fields at 10-meter intervals, where the survey conditions are adequate for detecting the archaeological sites. For visual inspection, you're going to be doing this for areas of disturbance or areas with a steep slope that's over 20% at 30-meter intervals. And for shovel tests, we're going to do it if your visibility is less than 30%, with transects not to exceed 15-meter intervals. No-till agriculture fields, house lawns, and wooded areas need to be shovel tested. Let's see. And next slide, please. So when conducting a pedestrian survey, you have to make sure that the fields have been recently tilled and have been rain washed. If they have not been rain washed, you have to wait until that has occurred before you can do a pedestrian survey. Otherwise, you have to shovel probe. I've provided below 2 different images of difference between a no-till and a tilled field. It's required that all no-till fields, again, are shovel probe, regardless of your surface visibility. And next slide, please. When you're doing your shovel testing, the best practice is to start from the outside of the project area and work in towards the road. You can see in the 2 images below that the one on the left is starting in the center of the survey area, and the one on the right starts on the outside. The project area if the project area extends into a wooded or fenced-in area, you need to make sure that you're going into the woods to put your shovel test or within the fence area. Oftentimes, we're getting a lot of consultants that are doing shovel tests on the outside of the woods or outside of the fenced-in area. Again, you need to go within the woods or the fenced-in area. If your project extends into the road cut, you need to go above the road cut and test to make sure there's not any undisturbed soil. If you have elevated benches or possible rock shelters during the inspection, you should test for cultural materials. And if you have standing water, that does not necessarily need to be shovel tested. Next slide, please. So a survey transect that is about 30 meters long should have 3 probes excavated at 0, 15, and 30 meters rather than a single probe at the center, which is shown in image A. And an undisturbed survey area that is 30 meters wide should have 3 transects completed rather than 1. So at 0, 15, and 30 rather than 1 or 2 down the center, which is shown in B. So if we were going out and surveying this, we'd want you to survey like the image on the left and not the right. If you could go ahead and change the slide, please. So it's more important to excavate your shovel test than to stay on grid. If your shovel test falls on disturbance, such as a utility line, tree, sidewalk, or driveway, make sure you offset your grid. Make sure that when you are offsetting that you're not moving 15 meters to the next shovel test, just the area where you're going to avoid your disturbance. Offsetting your individual probes within the grid and keep your overall grid uniform. I provided 2 photos showing excess parcels that have been shovel tested and ways of moving your transect grid. Can you give me the next slide, please? The next thing I'm going to talk about is avoidance and the avoidance of buried utilities. So oftentimes we get our consultants asking us what the measure would be that we should do for buried water lines and cables, which would be 1 to 1.5 meters and 2.3 meters for sewer lines or large gas pipelines. I provided an image below that gives you the colors of flags that you may see in the field and what they represent. Next slide, please. And the last topic I'm going to discuss is slope. Sloped areas over 20% must be visually inspected for the presence of features. Now, the slope applies for natural topography versus road ditches or berms, which are inspected only for disturbance. A slope that's 20% means that in the 10-meter interval, the slope will rise or fall within 2 meters. Now, a tip for you guys, that's about eye level. And next slide, please. Do I have any questions?
Looks like Karen Wood has a question in the chat. Karen, do you want to jump in or all?
I'm it. Sorry. So Karen is asking or saying that her clients are being asked to perform archaeology before the right-of-way is shown on plans, especially for the MPPAs when there's a culvert or bridge replacement. They give an estimated area. I keep telling them we need the proposed right-of-way shown on plans, but they keep pushing back. How can I get through to them? Sean, do you have a good answer for that?
Nope, we hear this a lot from archaeologists who aren't being, given the plans they need to perform their work. And so it's the nature of the beast. Everything needs to be done as quick as possible. So they want everything done before the design's even finalized, which makes it hard on us as archaeologists and environmentalists to determine what exactly our impacts might be, right? But You know, we always advise just to, you know, try to survey a large enough area to cover any potential impact. So with a small structure, that might be, you know, what do we typically do? Like 50 feet either side of center line, usually just a transect either side of disturbed right of way. That seems to cover small structures. That one transect might not always be good enough for other types of work activities, other types of INDOT projects, but for culverts and small structure replacements, you know, it's difficult to really determine what your footprint should be, but we would just ask that, you know, the clients give kind of a worst case scenario of what the footprint would be to their sub-consultants, you know, to everybody who's working on the project, so that everyone's kind of looking at the same area. And hopefully when right of way is developed, you know, we have it covered. We don't want to have to go out and perform additional work. We want to look at a large enough area the first time we're out there, but we also don't want to look at, you know, 4 acres when only a half acre is going to be acquired, you know, so it's a balancing act. I don't really have a good answer. I know it's a problem in the field.
I think that is the only answer that we can really give, right?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think just in general, you know, we get, you know, consultants, environmental consultants, so kind of your prime consultants they'll develop a study area. And, you know, that's meant to cover wetlands, maybe a red flag, all sorts of resources, and that's generally too big for archaeology. And so that's something we want to avoid. We don't want, you know, we don't want people looking at a huge study, quote, you know, quote unquote study area. We want to try to be a little more specific than that. And so it's just really on the designers, you know, district designers and consultant designers to, like I said, try to give us a best case scenario. And if they can't put it on plans, at least do it in, you know, in text somehow. But yeah, it's a problem.
And then Matt has a tip about shovel probes are more limiting, he says, but for pedestrian survey, it is always good to walk a slightly larger area if possible, maybe an extra transect or two.
Yes, that's a good general practice. If the right of way is unknown and you're asked to look at a general area and you have, you know, really good visibility in a tilled field, by all means, walk a larger area so that you know that you're covered. Understand that, yeah, shovel probes take more time. They're more costly. And so that's, you know, we wouldn't advise doing a whole lot of extra transects if only one transect of shovel probes will get it done.
One other point is that it's really important that the shapefile sent to us for our review is the area that the archaeologist looked at, because that will also show us if we have data that's been developed, or, you know, plans or something that's been developed after the archaeological survey. We can compare them, or hopefully the consultants will compare them before they send those survey areas, those archaeological reports to us. Because it's important that those shapefiles show exactly what was done for that very reason.
Yeah, that's a great point, and so that's why we ask for the survey area so that we know exactly what the archaeologists looked at, and if plans come in later, we can easily, compare what was surveyed to the actual right-of-way limits. And when we start getting shape files for generic study areas and things like that, it's tough for us. It just makes it more difficult for us to compare and contrast. So that's why we're interested in the actual areas surveyed and not so much as study area, project area, archaeological APE, so on and so forth. Just really, what did you look at? That's really what we want to know. And the survey area, as Patty Jo indicated, that should include existing right of way and any proposed right of way, any permanent or temporary right of way that may be acquired. And if you don't have that, try to use the worst case scenario or best case scenario to develop your survey area.
Thanks, Sean and all. And probably in the interest of time, Dave, if you're ready, we're ready for you.
Yep, I am ready. I don't know if you'll be able to see me. I can't tell if my video is working.
Yeah, we see you.
All right. Okay, so you can change to the next slide. So one area where we get persistent questions is, I'm going to turn my video off so I can make sure my microphone's not covered up. One area we get persistent questions about is when to complete a phase 1C and sorry. And there just seems to be a lot of variation in both when to make the recommendation and how it's reported in the archaeological reports. So this particular photo here is a trench in the Ohio River where there has been a lot of deeply buried sites recorded. So this was actually a relatively easy decision. But oftentimes those decisions are quite difficult. So the first thing we like to look at is the landform. Let's see, please go ahead and change the slide. You can see, you can kind of read the landform while you're out there, or there's also information just from maps and soil data about what landforms are expected. What we need to look at is places where sediments are likely to be deposited, more than 50 centimeters, because that's how deep shovel tests can go per the guidelines. And so this is typically in alluvial settings, floodplains, alluvial fans, terraces. We haven't seen a lot of phase 1Cs in colluvial settings, but at least be aware that you may need to dig your shovel test deeper in those areas. And by that, I'm talking about the base of slopes and benches on slopes where sediments might collect. And of course, we also need to be aware of other ways of transporting sediments, particularly human. If there's fill, we should be trying to get beneath it in shovel test in urban areas that may in fact require a phase 1C. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. All right, so the information we always include is the soil series. These are for people who aren't as familiar with them, these are the named soils that we get from soil survey books or now from the web. they have, each series has a number of things in common, including a common landform and parent material. And each one's also, we're also always provided a sample stratigraphy for that soil. We should be looking at this information before we go into the field because it can drive our methods, you know, whether we bring an auger or not. And we can also compare what we're seeing to the expected stratigraphy so that, well, we can, one, determine if that's the actual soil series there. Those reports aren't intended to be 100% accurate. They're the best available information from the soil service. And go ahead and go to the next slide, please. The other thing that we would like people to look at are the soil orders or soil types. These are, again, classifications of soils with common attributes. One of those attributes is the length of time it takes for that type of soil to form. Here we're talking about, as you see, F-sols, which tend to take a very long time to form. They tend to be older surfaces, like Pleistocene or older surfaces, excuse me. And so buried cultural horizons are unlikely. Entosols, which are soils with little or no evidence for soil development. Very few have buried cultural deposits. Septisols, which are soils with a minimal or weak development. They're recent soils, recently developed soils, and they can have buried cultural deposits, mostly because of whatever was there before the current sediment load was deposited there. And soil began to reform. And we have mollisols, which are formed in the late Pleistocene to Holocene, and they often have buried cultural deposits in the right settings. There's information in the two links that we can provide with the link that Kevin asked for. The first one is a link where you can show, you can enter in the soils series and get what kind of soil order you have. And the next one is the USDA's soil taxonomy, a basic system of soil classification for making and interpreting soil surveys if you really want to get into more detail. Can you go to the next one? This is just a shot of that link that I had, the first one. And we're looking at Huntington soil. This is the kind of information you get when you put that in there. All you put is Huntington. So if it, you don't need to put silt loam or the slope. In fact, it won't come back with anything. You have to only put the name. But you can, hopefully you can see that is one of the first things that it tells you is that Huntington soil is a mollisol. It looks like those links are getting added to the chat as I speak. Can you go ahead and go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the recommendation in the report. We'd like to make sure that those recommendations are multivariable and consistent, which is and when I say multivariable, I mean, talk about the landform and soil series and the soil type or order. And make sure that what you're seeing in the field matches what you're talking about as far as the information goes, because again, those original series data aren't always correct. You have to make sure that the series that is mapped in that location matches what you're seeing in the field. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. We just went through a couple quick examples of different soils and recommended, loosely recommended verbiage for the recommendation. So the first one is a bird silt loam. Again, you wouldn't put silt loam in the that linked website, just bird. So from the soil series, you get that it's formed in silty alluvium on floodplains. The soil type, we found it was an intesol, which are unlikely to have very cultural deposits. And when we were actually in the field, we could see that it was, well, it was a wide floodplain. It was a shallow plow zone over subsoil that was reduced. And so my recommendation will be that the project area is located on a wide floodplain. However, the soil stratigraphy observed in the shovel test was shallow, AP over reduced subsoil. Bird soils are intersols with low potential for buried cultural deposits. Phase 1C archaeological investigation is not recommended. So this is it. So everything kind of lines up and it's consistent with what I saw, as well as what was documented in that area, and it's kind of it's good to have that kind of very transparent recommendation for phase 1Cs, especially if it's in alluvium. Go ahead and do the next slide, please. This is just an example for Huntington silt loam. This, as you can read through the information there, the recommendation is that the project area is located in a wide, well-drained floodplain. Augers excavated the floodplain, demonstrated a deep B horizon, extending to 1 meter below the surface. Mollisols in the setting have potential for buried cultural deposits to exist. Therefore, a phase 1C archaeological excavation investigation is recommended. So, and one important note here is that augers were taken out because it was known that there was potential for buried deposits deeper than 50 centimeters. And so this is an example where looking at that background information can drive field methods. So does anybody have any questions about this or anything, absolutely anything?
And I'll just say we're at 1:30 right now, but we'll hang around here for a minute just to make sure no one else has any questions or comments. But if you need to go, it's great having you, and thanks, and be in touch with us with ideas for the next session. But please, questions for David.
And the links have been, some of the links we've been talking about are in the chat too. So if you don't have your chat open, you can see some links to the resources that we've been talking about. Any questions for our archaeologists while they're all on here?
And we'll take questions from anything. It doesn't need to, be associated with any of the presentation topics.
Well, I guess we got a raised hand. Jeff, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear. So I have a project that was previously surveyed in 2008 by a consultant, and that was reviewed and approved, but the project never went forward, and now it's going forward, and because there's some additional areas, I'm assuming I need to go back and double check those areas that were shovel probed because they were not screened at that time. But I guess I'm wondering what happens if So on a project, using that as an example, if for the client, if they wouldn't have been adding anything to that project, would they ever know that they need to have somebody go back out and resurvey those areas? Does that make sense?
Hi, Jeff. This is Sean. I think I understand your question, and my answer is yes. You'd have to resurvey that entire project area. That if it's still, whatever was surveyed in 2008, if it's still part of this current project, then it needs to be surveyed according to current standards. In addition to any new right of way that's being added. The client wouldn't have known that until they hired an archaeologist to reinitiate section 106. But this is consistent and in line with guidance we've given recently to another consultant, and it was a big project, new alignment, and it was surveyed. I can't remember if it was 2007 or 2008, but it was before shovel probing at 15-meter intervals and screening. And so even though they're just adding minor right-of-way amounts, they resurveyed the entire realignment and actually identified 5 sites that were not previously identified. So that change in methodology or changing consultant definitely makes a difference. So I'm sorry.
So in those cases, should we then, because listening to you guys talk before, the client may also need to engage above ground resources for that project since it was looked at in 08. Is that correct?
Oh yeah. Does it have the same designation number as it did?
No, actually, I think on this particular project, they've given the new stuff a new DES number.
Okay. So section 106 was probably accomplished, and then the project, for whatever reason, was not let, and now they're restarting the project, probably from new. So I think we would just initiate 106 as if nothing happened. I think. I don't know. So much time has passed, and it's a new a new DES number. We'd probably have to, there'd be a discussion with the historians and our NEPA group to determine what all needs to be done.
Yeah, it's just speaking from an above ground perspective, that would definitely be too long ago for us to kind of, we would need a new historic property report. It's just, we can't go off of, what the determination was 12 years ago. Like with archaeology, our practices have changed, things can become historic, every day, new things could be considered historic. So that's where we really, would like you guys to contact us early on, and we can coordinate case by case. I see. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, okay, thanks, guys. I will. So it sounds like in those instances, especially for this particular project that I'm thinking of, I need to discuss this more with the client because I don't think they know all this. Does that make sense? I'm not sure. It also happens to be a client who we don't always get good right-of-way maps from. So I'm not really sure that they understand that all needs to be reinitiated. So I'll check with them. Thank you.
This is actually like a common area for problems or issues with cultural resources. I don't know that there's a expiration date once 106 has been done for a project per se, other than the methods issue. However, we often get older projects or older projects that have been redesigned so that there's, you know, a little bit more area in different places along the undertaking. And one thing that we need people to be conscious of is that the undertaking is still the entire project area. We're assessing what amount of work needs to be completed. However, if there are archaeological sites documented within that undertaking, the best practice would be to go out and reevaluate those sites if possible. You know, assuming that they're still there. And this is an issue that's come up in different ways several times in the last year or so. But just be aware that, you know, if we get a report with, you know, that where you have, you know, 5 small areas attached to an older undertaking, we would like to see those sites within the larger undertaking reevaluated, unless it was, you know, a year ago. If a short time, if a longer time has passed, we'd like to see those sites reevaluated in the report.
Yep.
I see we have Veronica. You raised your hand. You want to jump in?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Good. Going back to the cemetery development plans, I just had one quick question. So if we have like a road resurfacing project or something where maybe there's not going to be new right of way, but but the cemetery comes right up adjacent to the road, it would be within 100 feet. Would you still want the CDP in that case, or is it only if there's some sort of new right of way that encroaches on the cemetery?
Hi, Veronica. This is Sean. So if I understand the question correctly, you're saying a cemetery that abuts existing right of way. Is that right? And you just have an HMA overlay?
Yeah, yes. Like I'm thinking of like an urban setting where you have, pretty defined boundaries and,
Right.
but the cemetery comes right up to the road.
Yeah. So in those cases, we would not require a cemetery development plan unless there was a specific impact to that cemetery. So this sounds like it's a typical city cemetery that's well defined and bordered. And we would only request a cemetery development plan, like if the HMA overlay as part of that was for whatever reason using temporary right of way or some type of easement to tie into the driveway or something, correct a driveway issue or something weird. And those come up sometimes.
So would that need to be like addressed in the ECL, or would there need to be some acknowledgement that like, yes, we're aware of this cemetery, but it's not being encroached upon or disturbed?
You really don't need to address cemetery development plans in 106.
Okay.
Because it's a state law, not a federal law. Like I said earlier, it's really we just try to prepare them when they're required as part of NEPA, so that we can see that they're done. If they can't be done during NEPA, then we ask that a commitment be made that it will be done before construction. So it's really, we try to do it during NEPA just to, try to make certain that it's done, but it's not a requirement of NEPA and it's not a requirement of 106.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
Anybody else?
Last call for questions.
Well, as we wrap up, feel free on this chat, or you can respond to the meeting invitation for, again, We encourage any ideas or suggestions or comments about the brown bag and what you'd like to see in the future. And we really appreciate all the archaeologists taking up time to prepare this presentation and sharing it, and also for everybody participating today and calling in.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Everybody, go ahead. Did somebody want to say something? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, happy Archaeology Month to everyone.
Thanks, Anthony.
All right.
All right. Bye.
I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.